Welcome back to Movie Guys Improvise, the MGI podcast. You are listening to
Chill with Realms.
Jurassic Mark
and Faerhad Targaryen. So, last week we talked about a semi-horror thriller movie from 2009 called Triangle. Great movie in its own right. Go and check that episode out if you haven't already. For today's episode, we wanted to talk to you about a classic from way back in the day, 1956, known as Forbidden Planet. Pretty interesting choice. I had heard of this movie myself before this episode, before I had a chance to watch it myself. Jurassic Mark, this movie was your choice, so why don't you tell us a little bit about what the movie is and why you decided to have this be today's episode?
Well, like Faerhad Targaryen said, this is a classic science fiction film. It's set in the 23rd century. Essentially, it's a rescue mission story about a starship that has been dispatched to a planet called Altair 4, where another crew was sent 20 years earlier, and the new crew is attempting to figure out what happened to that first lot because nobody's heard anything from them. And they discover that there are only 2 human survivors of the first expedition. You've got a fairly sketchy character named Morbius and his lovely daughter named Ita. That's essentially the size of it. I don't want to get into spoiler territory too much, but this was a very influential piece of science fiction. It influenced Star Trek. It influenced Star Wars. It had a lot of strange references to Sigmund Freud's psychological theories. And I like this one personally very much because back in the 50s, they usually didn't give sci-fi movies actual budgets. Like, they made these things with shoestring and bubble gum for the most part. And this movie actually had really high production value. I think it looks great. But that's my opinion. What do you guys think?
In my opinion, this movie, for what it was in 1956, I wouldn't even say this was a shoestring budget. This budget for Forbidden Planet in 1956 was $1,968,000, according to Wikipedia, close to $2 million. I don't know, according to inflation, how much that would be in present time, but just watching the movie on YouTube, I thought the production value was great. When we saw the planet for the first time, I thought, wow. I mean, even though clearly the technology used to make this movie was quite old, watching the movie, I'm convinced that in this universe, that planet is a real place. It looks like a real place, and I'm convinced that this setting is real. At least I was immersed, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
So what I meant was most science fiction movies back then didn't get budgets, and this one did. Like, usually sci-fi movies were made on the cheap for the most part, but this was a rare exception. So, anyway.
Oh, I see. So I misunderstood. You meant that, yeah, most movies did not have a lot of money made into it that were sci-fi. This was one of the first that had a considerable budget going into it. Got it. Okay.
All right, carry on.
Realms, how about you?
I was actually really surprised because initially when you said it was going to be a really old movie, I was expecting the worst. And then I went onto YouTube and I looked up the movie and I found a preview for it, and it was very bad quality. But then when I went to actually rent the movie, it was in much more clearer vision.
Exactly, yeah. It was the typical HD, like the maximum for a movie like this that you can watch on YouTube, until if one day it gets remastered in 4K. Although I don't know what the technology is required to remaster stuff in 4K, but the way I saw it on YouTube, it looked phenomenal. So yeah, as Jurassic Mark was saying, this movie consists of a starship headed by their commander, John J. Abrams, played by Leslie Nielsen. Dr. Edward Morbius was played by Walter Pidgeon. The thing about this actor is that I feel like I've heard that name so many times in the past. Walter Pidgeon. But this might be the first movie I've ever seen with this legendary actor in it. I will say though, the look of the character reminded me of Ra's al Ghul from Batman Begins and The Dark Knight Rises. Are you guys familiar with those Batman movies?
Yeah.
Yes. Classic.
All right, yeah, I'm glad I'm not the only one who felt that way. Cool. So, as the movie begins, so spoiler warning, we are going to go into spoiler territory for this almost 60-year-old movie. The the movie begins with Commander John J. Abrams, commanded by his commander on Earth, to head out to the planet Altair to figure out what happened to the Earth expedition some 20 years earlier than that. They're in contact with Dr. Edward Morbius, and he strongly advises against the new expedition team landing onto the planet. But they do it anyway, even though Dr. Morbius made it sound really dangerous. I didn't really get it, though. What I was expecting when they landed was to see, like, a planet teeming with alien life, alien civilizations. They do eventually mention an alien species called a Crow, although I don't think we ever see a Crow in the movie, but Dr. Morbius talks a lot about them. The first character that we are greeted to on this planet was Robbie the robot. Jurassic Mark, at the end of the Triangle episode, you did mention that there was a funny robot, and you can't go wrong with the funny robot. And I will say, Robbie was probably one of, if not my favorite character in the movie.
Yeah, Robbie was great. I love that line about how he rarely uses oxygen because it promotes rust and things like that. You know, he's a fun character. Very expensive prop at the time, but he still looks great, like, as an effect. You know, I think Robbie the robot's held up incredibly well. And he's got personality.
Oh yeah. After I had completed watching the movie, I watched a couple of other YouTube videos breaking it down. I'll put them in the description below as well. But you're right. Apparently back then, Robbie the robot was a really, like, he was one of the things, I guess one of the props that made the budget kind of expensive. But he was really popular. He was so popular that character, the robot character Robbie, went on to be in other movies outside of Forbidden Planet, which I thought was also really cool.
Oh yeah, he was in Gremlins, actually. Like, he makes a brief cameo in the Inventors Convention scene in Gremlins.
Gremlins, yeah. See? There you go. There's another one right there.
Robbie gets around, man. He's been in a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
As soon as he pulled up, I was like, "What up, Bender?" And it didn't help that he was drinking that alcohol later on, trying to figure out the actual what was it? The particles of it, or the molecules.
Oh yeah, the alcoholic molecules that went into making that. I think it was bourbon, right? That's what the cook was looking for. The cook too, yeah. I think the cook might also be one of my favorite characters. He was mostly kind of there just for comic relief, but he bonded with Robbie. As far as side characters go, I think he bonded with Robbie the most. He mentioned after the ship was sabotaged, he mentioned how when Adams was interrogating each of the people on his crew, he was like, "Cook, where were you this whole time?" And he essentially said he was getting drunk with Robbie that entire night.
Hey, man, that's the way to do it. Get drunk with a robot.
I kind of thought he was bonding a little bit too much at one point, because he was like, is he a boy or a girl? Which threw me off, because he said his name was Robbie. It said his name was Robbie. And then he starts going off into, like, the side corner. And I'm thinking, oh, no, is he going to try to do stuff with this robot? But then that's when he asked him to make the alcohol.
Oh, man. Yeah.
It's a Guillermo del Toro movie in a second, like The Shape of Water shit. But pardon my French.
Oh, man. Yeah. He said I remember the cook asking that question, and then Robbie answering in a way that sounded so philosophical. At least that's what it sounded like for some. It made me laugh because I thought, wow, this robot actually has some personality.
Yeah.
More personality than a stripper I met before. I hung out with a stripper one time, and then every question I asked her, she was like, "That's subjective." No matter what I asked her.
Wow.
Oh. Well, I didn't think I'd hear a stripper anecdote today, but I salute you, sir.
So,
my bad, yo.
Well done.
Don't you just hate when you just get one-word answers out of conversations?
Oh, yeah, it's the worst.
So, Robbie proceeds to take our team over to Morbius's home. We meet Morbius. We also meet Morbius's daughter, Altera. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Jurassic Mark, was she named after the planet?
I think that's implied, yeah.
Okay. If that is the case, then I feel like just going off of Morbius' story, because when I started watching the movie, I wasn't sure if I could trust Morbius or not, but going along with his words, the expedition that he landed with, they were all murdered by some mysterious force on the planet. His wife later died of natural causes, so the only person his daughter Alta ever knew, was himself. But does this mean that his wife was pregnant when they got there, or was his daughter born and her name was just changed to Altera later? I don't know. That's one part that was confusing me.
I think his wife got pregnant in transit, because he said that they were married on the ship, so they were probably, getting a little bit intimate on the ride over. So maybe by the time they got to the planet, she was already pregnant.
It definitely had to be, because I think he said she died 2 months after the crew died, so she had to be pregnant on the way.
Yeah, I guess you get bored on spaceships, so you got to find something to do. But
okay, yeah, that makes sense. The rest of the planet seemed pretty barren, though. I mean, later on, we see Adams and the doctor, Dr. Ostro, checking out all of the Krell technology and stuff, and he was explaining how they also mysteriously vanished 200,000 years ago, and he came and he discovered all of this. So another question I have that was kind of unclear to me, along with the random deer and the tiger that was there, that were Alta's air quote friends, the house that was there, that was like built there already, or that's basically my question. Did Dr. Morbius build that home himself, or is that the home of a former Krell person?
I think it's a little of column A, a little of column B, because all the subterranean structures that we find were built by the Krell. That's why they had those weirdly shaped doors so that the Krell could walk through them. But we also know that after Morbius started messing around with their mind-enhancing technology, that he gained proficiency in a lot of fields. So I think he did build at least some of his home himself. We know he built Robbie himself, so he would have had the capacity to build at least a lot of what we saw on the surface.
Okay, that makes sense as well. At least the emergency shutter doors, I think that was with Krell technology, the metal, but I think he built those like emergency shutter doors himself as well.
He used Krell technology to build a lot of the things that became important to him in his life and whatnot.
Right. Now, before getting into the nitty-gritty of the plot, I want to ask both of you gentlemen, what did you think of the soundtrack, the score, or at least the lack thereof a soundtrack? Like, I want to hear both of your impressions on this one.
I was a little bit thrown off with the soundtrack, especially the beginning noises, where it's doing that kind of screeching sound. I guess you want to say it is. I don't know if screech is the right description for it, but it was interesting. It kind of gave me like I guess like the weird vibes that they were going for.
Yeah, it set the tone, definitely. Yeah, you really don't hear theremins that much. That was what that like electronic sound was. It was really popular in like 50s alien movies, but you don't hear it too much nowadays. But yeah, I enjoyed it, but I'm also used to it because I watch a lot of movies from this period.
Oh, okay. So I guess you have kind of like a thing for the oldies and the classics, Jurassic Mark.
Oh yeah, I love old sci-fi movies. I was raised on like Mystery Science Theater, so I love this stuff.
Very good, very good. So, Realms, it's interesting how you describe the sound effects in the beginning as screeches, because my girlfriend, my fiance, who I was watching this with, she was saying that it sounded very screechy to her as well. I don't really know how I felt about it personally, because in a way, it's almost like there wasn't a score for this movie. It's the only sound effects we get is just that, is sound effects, but there aren't really any like scores set behind it. You know what I mean?
definitely had a score, because not all of those musical notes would have come from like the machinery that we heard and whatnot. But no, I understand what you're saying there.
Okay, yeah, I know it's a confusing point, but I can't really convey how I feel any other way, except for the way that I explained to it. So, I wanted to talk about Alta for a moment. I thought it was funny how all three dudes, when they meet her for the first time, they all came off so thirsty, all of them. But I mean, Adams held himself back the most, but Jerry Farman, he wasted no time in trying to, I guess, flirt at all.
My boy was asking old dude if he could make some allowances with his daughter.
Yep. God.
And Morbius played it so cool too. It's maybe he knew that nothing was gonna come out of it, so he just wasn't really all that concerned. And it turned out to be true, because as later on, when Fairman tries to like forcibly kiss Alta a few times, she didn't really feel anything. She felt no chemistry out of it, and it kind of made sense. Then later, Adams gets mad at Alta. Alta storms off. And then later she shows back up again, but this time she wears something that's a lot less revealing just to impress him. And then eventually they fell in love. At first, I thought that was a little too quick to happen, but perhaps Adams eventually started having feelings for her as well, and it just worked out in the end.
Here's the one thing, though. All right, so that one dude, he tried to, forcibly kiss her or whatever, tried to get her to get into that. And she acted like she didn't know what she was doing. But then she got with the skipper, and it seemed like she actually knew more of what she was doing than she actually let on.
I don't know, maybe she read some good books, because it's just been her and her father on this planet this whole time. So hopefully she just, I don't know, read a couple of romance novels.
Overnight studies.
Yeah.
That's a good way to prepare, although, Realms, to your point, because you have a pretty good point there, she did also mention to Adams, she asked something like, why don't you just kiss me like everybody else does? And he's like everybody else? What, have you learned nothing? Or that's basically his reaction to that. So, yeah.
Yeah, the movie is definitely a product of its time when it comes to like the old-timey, borderline sexist dialogue, but it came out in the 50s, It's to be expected, unfortunately.
True. With when we get to closing statements, I'll also mention how in another way this movie was also kind of a product of our time. But before we get to that, I also want to talk about the other elephant in the room, the mysterious monster. So most of the time this thing is invisible, but there was that one scene where we see it kind of outlined. To me, it kind of looked like an outline of both a gorilla and a lion at the same time. It's kind of what it looked like to me. I wasn't sure if it was supposed to look like any specific animal.
It kind of reminded me of like a rock monster. Like, I feel like I've seen something like that maybe on like Looney Tunes or something like that.
I think actually the person who animated that sequence with the monster being outlined in laser fire had done some work on Looney Tunes and whatnot. So if so, that would probably be why. Because I guess he's also a little bit like the big red monster that chases Bugs Bunny, like once in a while. But
Right. That makes sense.
I didn't even see that until you guys mentioned it, but now I can kind of see it in terms of it looking like a Looney Tunes kind of rock monster, like you were saying, Realm. So, along with the monster, I will say one of the issues I took with this movie was that I didn't really get the pacing of it. Like it kind of went from scene to scene. A lot of it was expose with Dr. Morbius showing off the Krell technology, but I didn't really get the conflict really going on from acts like 1 to 2 and then 2 into 3. One crew member, Chief Quinn, gets attacked and killed. The equipment is sabotaged. Yeah, that happened, but for the most part, it didn't seem that consequential to the storyline until Adams says to Morbius, you need to hand over all of this technology to Earth, and he vehemently disagrees with that. Then we have the showdown, and then the ultimate twist of the movie, which I thought was a really cool twist, that the monster is just a semi-physical manifestation of the id, or like his ego, Dr. Morbius's own ego. Right before that was revealed, I was kind of siding with Dr. Morbius because he was talking to me in a way that kind of reminded me of Dr. Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park. The line where he says, "Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they never stopped to think whether they should develop this technology or not." In terms of like creating these dinosaurs, like yes, we want to be able to create these dinosaurs, but let's stop to think, should we do it just because we have this power? So to me, Morbius was kind of making that point that yeah, the human mind, mankind, humanity, whatever you want to call it, we're always striving to surpass our limits, to go beyond our limits. And Morbius kind of says we shouldn't be playing God. We shouldn't be trying to play God all the time. At least that's the way I saw it. But then the twist is, it's his own ego, his own hunger for more knowledge is what caused that monster to become manifested. Like that machine in the Corel laboratory that enhanced his intelligence. He said his intelligence doubled after that. The same machine that killed Lieutenant Dr. Ostrom is eventually what led to everybody's demise. His own expedition, as well as himself eventually was attacking everybody, and it was his own ego. The last line of the movie after the planet is destroyed is Adam saying, "We are, after all, not God." So in the end, it was Morbius, I guess, playing God subconsciously and not even knowing it. It was his ego that was. How did you guys feel about the twist with the reveal of the id monster? Did you guys see it as a twist the way I saw it, or did you see it some other way?
The first time I saw this movie, I didn't quite see the twist coming, but you do get a sense that all is not as it seems on this planet, and you also get the impression that if Morbius isn't truly the bad guy, then he himself might not really understand all the technology he's been using. At least I kind of got that impression, but I didn't see the specific twist with the monster being a product of his own brain the first time I saw it. So that caught me by surprise.
I don't know. Honestly, it didn't really catch me off guard, but it did make sense in regards to how, it was only attacking everybody except him.
Yeah, that didn't really make sense to me either. Like, when the tiger was about to attack Adams and Alta, that surprised me. I didn't think that was ever going to happen, but it did. And then it was revealed that nobody except Morbius was saved from it because it was basically Morbius. It was all in Morbius's head, generating the monster itself. So yeah.
The one thing that confused me about the monster, though, when you first see it attack the ship, or at least sabotage the ship, it gets near it, and then you start seeing footprints. And then the next time it shows up, they're saying that, it's as big as a house now. It's bigger than it was before. But then you don't see any footprints or anything like that. That's what confused me. It's getting bigger, but you couldn't really see any changes to the terrain. Or at least they didn't show any changes.
Yeah, I think the product of someone's mind doesn't necessarily follow the same physical laws as other animals, because they also established that the thing's constantly changing its own molecular structure. So to me, that wasn't really an issue.
I understand what you mean in that, since it's not a actual physical being that it can kind of shapeshift. At the same time, though, I also see what Realms is saying. Even though it can change shapes, I think what he was saying is that the scene where the monster is revealed, we don't see footprints at all. Bigger or smaller, like an actual physical footprint isn't left after the scene. Or at least I think that's what he meant to say. So yeah, going into ratings. Well, actually, right before I go into ratings, I just wanted to mention how I was saying earlier that this movie is a product of its time, and at the same time, the time period where the movie came out, I think it can be classified as a masterpiece. A couple of things that I mean by that is the spaceship that Commander Adams is flying in along with his team looked like a stereotypical UFO. In modern day sci-fi movies, or even later on sci-fi movies, like the first few Star Wars movies, the spaceships don't look like typical UFOs. At least that's the way I remember it. I haven't seen very much of Star Wars, like I said in the previous episode. The other thing that I noticed was just the fact that there wasn't really any diversity in this movie. But again, that could just be because it was a product of its time. It was in 1956. And I don't think back then we could ever expect to see like a black or brown actor in a high budget movie like this. I would have loved to have seen it, but it was a product of its time in that manner as well.
Yeah, and in the ensuing decade, the 60s, we did get Star Trek, which was phenomenally diverse for its time. Like, Star Trek had it had a number of characters of color. But yeah, unfortunately in the 50s, diversity really wasn't a priority. So if they were remaking this movie today, I'd love to see a diverse cast. And I'd also love to see more female characters. But
exactly. There have been conversations being made to remake this movie, but I think those plans kind of fell through. But yeah. Besides the lack of diversity and basically how Acts 1 and 2, there wasn't really much going on except for expose, the way I saw it. Those are the only two issues I had with the movie. For going into ratings, I think this movie can still be classified as a masterpiece, barring the fact that there's also barely a score or soundtrack to it. I would give this movie another 7 out of 10.
For the rating, for my personal taste, I'd probably give it like a 6. But for somebody who's actually into sci-fi and all that, I would probably say more of a 7, 8.
7 or 8. But for your personal score, you'd give it a 6.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, thank you for that.
yeah. I would personally give it 9. I love this movie, warts and all. I recognize it's not perfect. Again, it's not very diverse. Some of the dialogue is pretty sexist when you think about it, but overall, I think it's a fantastic sci-fi movie. It was clearly very influential, and when you consider the kinds of science fiction movies that were coming out at the time, people who went to see this must have reacted the same way people did when they saw James Cameron's Avatar in like 2009. Like, it was a special effects extravaganza back then, and it still held up really well. So, yeah, I love this movie.
Very true, very true. It's interesting that you give it a 9. That's a staggeringly high score. I was debating with myself, is 7 too low? Or, because I think the argument can be made for myself that it deserves a higher score than that. But I was giving it that score based on how much I enjoyed it and how much I tried to be as objective about it as possible. The best part for me is just the special effects, I guess, because I was convinced, again, immersed in this world, because watching it made me feel like in this universe, planet Altera was a real place. But yeah. So for Realms, we had a 6. From me, we get a 7 and a 9. So pretty good scores. 9 is definitely I would say that's a masterpiece rating right there. Not all masterpieces have to be a 10. So 9. You would call this a masterpiece, right?
Undeniably. And, in addition to the special effects, I really did enjoy the story, which was actually somewhat loosely based on Shakespeare's The Tempest, which I think the two of us saw in college, or at least I did. I know they were playing it when we were in college. But, Morbius was loosely based on Prospero and whatnot. But
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. I forgot to mention that. Tempest had a big influence on this as well. I don't remember much of Tempest. I'd have to go back and look into that as well, to be completely honest with you. But yeah, for the next episode, I want to talk about a movie that I've been wanting to have a platform to rant about for a really long time. Not sure if you have or have not seen it, depending how much you are into superhero movies. Captain America: Civil War.
All right. I've seen that one before, but yeah, I'd love to check it out again.
Got it. Okay, I've got some pretty strong feelings, pretty unpopular feelings for this movie, so I'd love to hear what you have to say about it for the next episode.
Okay, sounds good.
Very good. Very good. Great. So Yeah, that just about does it for this episode of Movie Guys Improvise. You have been listening to
Chill with Realms.
Jurassic Mark.
and Faerhad Targaryen. Thank you all so much for talking with us, and catch us again next week.
Appreciate you, boys.
Yeah.
I'll catch you later, everybody. Chill vibes only. Much love.
Peace.